Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 433, March 21st, 1980, side 1. I made a tape several weeks ago, tape number 430, that was February 29th, 1980, and I played some music from the opera Sweeney Todd, and on the printed sheet that accompanied the tape, the quotation of Stephen Sondheim and Harold Prince, "No one can help, nothing can hide you. Isn't that Sweeney there beside you?" That's from the musical opera Sweeney Todd, and I referred to quotations of Ronald Reagan and called him California's Sweeney Todd, and George Bush, a candidate then at the time for President of the United States, he may be in the future, and talked about some murders that he covered up when he was director of the CIA, and how he believes that we shouldn't intrude into other people's, quotes, morality if they want to continue these assassinations, and it's expedient for them. Of course, the name Sweeney Todd is taken, as I say, from a play on Broadway now that will be part of the New York opera repertoire, and it's about a barber in England on Fleet Street who commits a lot of murders, one continuous murder after another, to avenge society for wrongs that were done to him. It's a very important play, and of course this week we have a new name in the news, just coincidentally, the name Dennis Sweeney. So again, we're back to Sweeney Todd, and here was a Stanford student, an anti-war activist, somebody concerned with civil rights who was in the South working for black people to get them registered to vote. He was injured by a bomb in the civil rights movement, and he came back to avenge somebody that he didn't trust, who he felt betrayed him, and murdered former Congressman Allard Lowenstein. So Dennis Sweeney that is in the anti-war, the peace movement, the lovable person can be brought out if they are manipulated by the proper set of circumstances. And most of this tape will be on Allard Lowenstein today. I did want to continue with Abscam 2 and 3 and 4. It's so terribly important. And I have a list of other stories here that took place this week, but I'm just going to have to put them off, and we'll talk about Allard Lowenstein, because it does encompass a whole era about what is happening, who his friends are, my views of the murder, and particularly the involvement of Dennis Sweeney, because it's a terribly important story. Next week, I hope to get into some of these events. I don't want you to lose track of them. I'll just list them briefly, the information I was going to share with you, and we'll get back to it. Some has to do, as I say, with many articles on Abscam and the FBI investigations that are taking place, the update on Raymond Pecunier with the murder of the 33 informers in the New Mexico jail, the FBI plans to attack organized crime across the United States, the links of Jimmy Carter, Robert Strauss, the drug connections to Panama, Vesco, and the Swiss banks. New stories came out this week. More about the CIA controls and what it means and how they're tightening their controls. I'll go into the Dr. Herman Tarnauer murder in New York with Jean Harris, the school marm, and important avenues to look into her background and the motives for that murder. The Kenneth Parnell Barbara Mathias kidnapping ring in Ukiah and Mendocino, California, and the implications of this. Ted Kennedy and the Chappaquiddick affair, and that mysterious Helga Wagner and the telephone calls. I want to go into the mafia trial in New Jersey involving the Genovese family, the late Anthony Russo. New information coming out on that murder trial, several people being indicted there. The New Jersey coroners that are filled with inadequate persons charging what are obvious murders being opened again, called suicide or natural deaths, and the problem of organized crime in the coroner's offices all over the United States and overseas. A woman and her husband, Charlene and Lyman Smith, were murdered this week. He was about to be appointed judge on the Superior Court by Jerry Brown, and a friend was to come over and tell him he was sure to be in, and he and his wife were bludgeoned to death. Mayor Janet Smith, a mayor in Vermont, was murdered. Ex-Mayor Russell Lloyd from Indiana was murdered. There's millions of dollars of cash missing in Miami, diamonds floating from Israel to Los Angeles, security exchange documents missing. Iowa has a state of emergency. The farmers are bankrupt because of up to $10 million in fraudulent money taken from them, and still missing part of this general organized crime. I'm sure the links of stolen securities, the middleman, the working man, flounced out again and robbed. There's a secret trial in Contra Costa County, that's the most sensitive trial going on in the United States today. No information coming out about that at all, and we'll go into possible reasons for secrecy. 5 defendants in Los Angeles in the ab scam connections were dismissed. They were responsible for killing Frank, the Bonfanciero, member of organized crime. That has to do with Judge Pragerson, who was about to be given gifts or bribe, and the FBI warned him before he could get the bribes. All of a sudden, their case was dismissed. Articles coming out this week on Kansas City mob murders, 11 in the past 3 years, and the implications of the FBI and former FBI Director Clarence Kelly, who now works with Wackenhut organization in Florida, and they are in charge of security out here at Fort Ord, at military bases and airports. Mob murders in Kansas City, the Teamsters murders. A witness, James Fratriano, tells how he took part in 9 murders for the Teamsters, that La Cosa Nostra controls the Teamsters organizations, and he's testifying against La Cosa Nostra in San Francisco. Attorney General William Scott was indicted in Illinois one day after his nomination in the primaries. He was running for senator from Illinois and was defeated the next day, indicted. Allegedly has large sums of money, makes trips to Europe quite frequently, didn't declare the campaign money, and his attorney, one of his attorneys in this case, is Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor for Charles Manson, working with the CIA and covering up the narcotic rings and drug connections in Los Angeles that had to do with the Sharon Tate La Bianca nest of worms. And then the New Jersey abscam witnesses, there's another couple in New Jersey, David Emmerich and Bonnie Pellissier, who are missing. Their house, they found instruments that they were bludgeoned with, flesh in the walls and so forth. This couple are missing. They have to do with the abscam investigations in New Jersey. There's more going on in Pennsylvania. There are many Sweeney Todds and murders and blood literally dripping from the pages of the files every day. I'm opening up an important interconnecting links that I couldn't possibly do in an hour a week. It just really hurts not to be able to tie these tight together for you with all the implications. And I simply run them off now because of the frustration of not being able to handle them. But hopefully in the next few weeks we'll get back to each of these things with a little more detail. But I just want you to know some of the stories that are going on. And in your own cities and hometowns, if you have judges, lawyers, soon to be appointed, people that lost the election, about to win the election, who are being murdered, send them, and maybe we can put them together and come out with some kind of a profile or nest and see if they do link to the organized crime abscam investigations that are going on at the present time. Several months ago on a tape, I talked about the the hit-and-run accident of an attorney in San Francisco, James Martin McInnes, and he's working with private sleuth Harold Lipset, and these men were working with a man who has been investigated involving hash that came into San Francisco, a large shipment of hash from Afghanistan. 547 pounds of Afghan hash patties were slipped into San Francisco before the DEA could get on their trail. And I did a story just briefly mentioning the untimely death of James Martin McInnes at an intersection in San Francisco. And then a few months later, the San Francisco Chronicle has an article that he was attorney for one of the men involved in this hash situation. There's been a long series of articles in the Chronicle, and I'll update them for you, but it's very important to know that what looks like hit-and-run cases or suicides or natural deaths, all of a sudden, months later, years later, you find out that these people were very important in this large narcotic traffic pattern, which is barely being exposed now, but because of the FBI use of informers who are willing to talk, there'll be many, many people killed all over the country to keep a lid on how high up in the government the narcotics traffic really rolls. With that little resume of blood and trials and so forth and promises of tapes to come, we'll go on to Allard Lowenstein. First, who was Allard Lowenstein? And then secondly, who is the man who killed him? course, many of you who have taken the tapes for a long time know that I'm very interested in mind control and the use of hypnosis, assassins, trained assassins, to wipe out persons for any number of reasons, and also the usefulness of programming people with electrode implants or drugs or hypnotism to let them become murderers because they're least suspected if they melt into the milieu in which they work to begin with. Instead of just walking in and shooting, you can have your choice. Dan White could be hypnotized and go in and kill Harvey Milk and George Moscone at a very important time when Jonestown was happening, and there were links of these people to Jonestown. You could hypnotize a person and throw them right in, and their memories erased, and they're useful as assassins because they can't reveal what they did or follow it up afterwards. This was the case with Sirhan. Sirhan, when Robert Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel, Sirhan has been in a state of a trance or hypnosis ever since about the events that occurred. And Jack Ruby suffered the same consequences after shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. His mind was erased, and he was not very able to go into why he did it or who he saw before or how it happened that he was allowed to walk in the police department and kill Lee Harvey Oswald, the only suspect in the assassination of President John Kennedy. I became very interested in mind control and the use of hypnosis and electrode implants when I studied information about Dr. Jose Delgado at Yale University, his electronically controlled persons and animals and his psychosurgery, and then the position of people like Jack Ruby and Sirhan Sirhan or James Earl Ray or Artie Bremer, who shot George Wallace. David Berkowitz is one of these, and there's many, many more. There's an army of people under mind control that are useful for murders, political murders, to silence people, and then these zombies have no recall or don't sound logical as to why they actually got into the position they did when they did the killings. There have been many articles and documents about the mind control, particularly of Sirhan, but there are quotations that come regarding Jack Ruby at the time that I say he shot Lee Harvey Oswald. There was a Dr. W. Bromberg, a psychiatrist from New York, who was quoted in literature and books saying that Ruby was preset to attack. There definitely was a block to his thinking. It was not part of his original endowment. Dr. M. Guttmacher from Baltimore said Ruby's brain had been damaged and he couldn't figure out how, that he showed functional psychosis, not organic, and he defined functional psychosis as a psychotic condition for which there is no known organic cause. He didn't have brain damage. There was a Dr. Schaefer from Yale University, staff psychologist, clinical professor of psychiatry at Yale, who said Ruby lost the ability to control his own actions. He appears to feel not in control of his body actions as if they occurred independently of his conscious will at times. And then Melvin Belli, Jack Ruby's lawyer, was quoted as saying, motivation for killing Lee Harvey Oswald came from some strange manifestation of Ruby's brain that could not be accounted for. Jack Ruby went to a telegraph office where he was to send a telegram to a woman called Little Lynn, who telephoned him. He left his apartment, then went to the office and walked down the ramp, was allowed, or was in a car in the basement of the police station and came out and shot Lee Harvey Oswald. But these are just some descriptions from an attorney and 3 doctors about the state of mind of Jack Ruby. And I bring this up because I had studied mind control, as I say, and the quotations of these people going back from 1964 up to the present day, and have approximately 20 books on mind control and government programs, a good library of some of the best books, and then many, many articles, a huge filing cabinet drawer of instances of known electrode implants and mind control. So I've studied it quite at length in terms of how it relates to specific political activities, assassinations, and causes for political effect. Now, just last week, Ted Kennedy was campaigning for President of the United States, and Allard Lowenstein was very vocal down in Miami trying to get the Jewish vote because of the goof at the United Nations of Jimmy Carter and the vote against Israel, and he was rallying. Of course, Jewish support or the left support for Ted Kennedy in Illinois, and he would have done it in New York. And just at the time that he was opposing Jimmy Carter or trying to bring out any latent feeling for Ted Kennedy that any of the candidates could muster, he wanted these voters to come out of the woodwork for Ted Kennedy at a time when Jimmy Carter seems to be winning, right after calling attention to the goof of Carter with a Jewish vote down in Florida. The next week, Allard Lowenstein was murdered in New York City. At the time that this goof went on of Jimmy Carter and his anti-Semitic stance that he's been showing a little more each week, I had a feeling of calling Ted Kennedy again. I swore to myself I never would, but I felt, the only way Ted is going to win, particularly after the stories coming out about the Chappaquiddick phone calls and so forth, the only way he could ever win would be to tell the truth about what happened to John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, his brothers, and that if he tried the route of just going along and opposing Carter on political events and not meeting him face to face, he couldn't possibly win. And Carter isn't out there campaigning at all, and Ted Kennedy is just talking in the wind. And one of the people that worked hand in glove with him in this trying to win the presidency was Allard Lowenstein, and then he was murdered, shot down last week. Now, the murder of Allard Lowenstein is simply a matter of knowing too much, too late, and doing nothing with it. There were stories, at one time Allard Lowenstein was in San Francisco with Bob Trevor on his radio program at KGO, and off the air he sort of suggested that Robert Kennedy was going to wait until he was president of the United States in 1968 elections, and then he'd open up the story of who killed John Kennedy. Robert Kennedy never lived. Then Allard Lowenstein became very active in the investigation of Robert Kennedy's assassination, and he knew the A to Z of that, even though he suppressed the Thane Caesar connections in the Ambassador Hotel and the Lockheed employment of Thane Caesar, or the fact that Thane Caesar now works, I understand, at La Costa for organized crime. Allard Lowenstein had the ability to comprehend who killed Robert Kennedy, but he never did anything about it. But he was very active in gathering information and usurping some of the researchers while staying off a lot of the mind control of Sirhan and the use of another assassin standing behind Robert Kennedy. Allard Lowenstein was active at one time investigating the Robert Kennedy assassination and working for Ted Kennedy, never active in the mind control field of people like David Berkowitz in New York, being victims of mind control, fighting, not fighting overtly, but avoiding the use of the mind control of the assassins until finally one of the zombies erased him out. He didn't work on the mind control, and he didn't expose who killed John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy, and trying to work for Ted Kennedy, he was murdered, and none of this came out, and it's a question of knowing too much, too late, and sitting on it for whatever reasons he sat on it. He never chose to expose some of the facts in these cases. My only contact with Allard Lowenstein was after the Boston Conference on Conspiracies in 1975, and I went to New York City, and there was a conference. I was talking at the Elgin Theater to a group of people, and there was a conference at New York University put on by Mark Lane and Allard Lowenstein, and some people wanted Mae Brussell to speak there. And among them was Allard Lowenstein, who said, "I'll never appear on the platform with Mae Brussell." He's never come to the House for research. He's never corresponded. He's never wanted any of the information that I've had. He stayed arm's distance from me, and so far as I know, the only researcher that he ever contacted or had a lot of work with was Lillian Castellana in Los Angeles. And when she told me that former Congressman Lowenstein was coming to visit her to get her research on Robert Kennedy's assassination, I warned her over and over again, be careful of Allard Lowenstein. I don't trust him. I believe he works with the CIA. He'll drain you. He'll take your information. He won't use it, and he won't expose it. Be very careful of him. And she let Allard in the house, and she shared her information. And then she really grieved shortly before she died, and she died just 2 years ago. She was really sorry that she had let Allard Lowenstein in the house, and she told that to me, and she agreed that I was right, that he would take information, that he would use some of her information and suppress the other, never really giving her credit for what she did and never carrying on the fight that Lillian was doing to open up the John Kennedy and the Robert Kennedy assassinations. There are a lot of people who loved Allard Lowenstein very much. When he was living or when he was dead, they praised him with great words. My friend Rush Harp was one of his closest friends, and I've had differing opinions with various people about Allard Lowenstein, and just as I have had about I.F. Stone. My only guide, say on a scale of 1 to 10, is not what people are associated with, but what they really accomplished. And if they could chalk up some accomplishments along the lines that I've been working on in exposing assassins and overturning the courts of certain criminals, political people that are locked up in American prisons, that could undo some of the legal knots that are binding us, such as the new laws on the CIA or the Senate Bill 1 that Ted Kennedy is getting us into, that terrible bind. Anyone who overturns these bad laws, who exposes murders that are lies, the official government versions that are lies, that works towards peace is, on a scale of 1 to 10, is the top in my view. And I don't rate people on who they mingle with or what they say they're going to do, but on the end result of what they do. Lowenstein was described as a man of peace. He saved us from the war in Vietnam. He was against violence. He was idealistic, humanistic, and conscientious. Those were some of the adjectives that were in the newspaper this week about Allard Lowenstein. For those of you who don't know him or don't know why I have opinions about him, I'll briefly run down that he worked for all the right causes, but everyone he worked for was a loser and went backward. And once they were dead, there wasn't much more done about it. He was sent to South Africa, supposedly on some investigations or parathoid cases very early in his career, and yet South Africa became more and more repressive, and there wasn't anything that white Americans were doing for apartheid or South Africa or have done to this day. He was described as working on behalf of the oppressed, but he was very closely linked to people from the intelligence community, the CIA, offices in Rockefeller Center. I don't know how that helps the oppressed. It doesn't mean you have to have offices in the slums, but it's an interesting place to be while you work, in quotes, with the oppressed. The newspaper described him as having sessions with underground in Franco, Spain, at the time of the Spanish Revolution, but he's not associated with the Lincoln Brigade, or I haven't seen any quotations from them. I've seen them from Pete McCloskey and Bill Moyers of the CIA and Bill Buckley, friends of the CIA, but I haven't seen anything from the people that actually fought against Franco in Spain. He walked in the South with Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King was assassinated, and I wasn't aware that Allard Lowenstein helped the House Select Committee on Assassinations or wanted to find out who killed King. Mrs. King was at his funeral, but I haven't realized that he was working hard with researchers to get the killer of Martin Luther King. He went to Yale Law School. He's very close to Buckley, and that's another can of worms with the CIA. He was the son of a physician and biochemist who taught at Columbia University. He led the campaign for Adlai Stevenson, a student campaign for Stevenson, and then Stevenson was murdered shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion that was called off by John Kennedy. Stevenson was poisoned in London, and never investigation into the killings of Stevenson. He worked for Robert Kennedy, who was murdered, and Lowenstein didn't get into that investigation until Ted Charach had made the movie The Second Gun. And as I say, I was doing radio shows since 1971 on the murder of Robert Kennedy and doing investigations from the time he was killed. And Lillian Castellana in L.A. and other people were becoming more open about our investigations, and this movie had been made, so Allard Lowenstein jumped into that. He worked for the National Student Association, which was identified as a CIA front. It was completely taken over the CIA right after he was working with that. He pushed the campaign of Eugene McCarthy, described in the book Who's Who in the CIA, and up till this election, McCarthy isn't running this year, but for the last years he's always split the Democratic vote and assured that the Republicans really got in. McCarthy was part of the CIA. He organized the Dump Johnson in 1968. Johnson was dumped, and then came Richard Nixon in the Watergate team, and that was a very nice manipulation. After they dumped Johnson, Robert Kennedy was killed, and Nixon was in office. Allard Lowenstein was with a lot of losers. He's described as a loser. He won an election in the House of Representatives once. He ran 6 other times, I believe, and lost, or almost 6, ran for the Senate and lost. He went out to Stanford University, where he met the man he was then a student, who was to kill him in the future, this Dennis Sweeney. And Stanford University, of course, is the law school, the medical school, and the history department are terribly controlled by the intelligence community, and that's where the Hoover Library is in the tower, and Stanford Research and their mind control experiment stations, which we'll go into later. He was an unpaid representative at the United Nations sent by Jimmy Carter. That's interesting that United Nations appointment would be given by Jimmy Carter to Allard Lowenstein, who had so many buddies in the CIA, because Lowenstein on the surface, or always was, very close to John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy. So it's interesting that an opponent of Jimmy Carter's would be given a position at the United Nations. They say he was a close friend of another Yale graduate, William Buckley of the Central Intelligence Agency, whose team, Douglas Caddy and Young Americans for Freedom, played a very instrumental part in the assassination of John Kennedy and were barely exposed at the time of Watergate. Newspaper article described his close friendship with George Bush and with Mr. Rumsfeld, a boxing partner, former Secretary of Defense. Allard Lowenstein had a lot of interesting connections, which don't prove at all that he was in the intelligence community, but not only did he have these close associations with all of the people that I've mentioned in the intelligence community, or those that were killed, that he never bothered to investigate. But at the time of his death this last week, he was buried at Arlington Cemetery. It's unusual for a Jewish family not to be buried together with the family, and as a public servant with one term in the House of Representatives, Allard Lowenstein was buried in Arlington Cemetery. I thought that was interesting and unusual, unless, as I say, he was also part of the intelligence community. And I've had my suspicions. There's no way to prove it, and the people that love Allard Lowenstein would say that I'm way off the wall, that he was a raving liberal, and yet we're on the brink of World War III, and I don't think that these liberals or the people he's associated with have done a thing to stop the trend that is getting us to face the Third World War. On the other side of this tape, I'm going into the person who shot Allard Lowenstein, Dennis Sweeney, and a little bit about mind control again, and how he was sent to murder him, and why I think he murdered him at this time. There was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle from Jackson, Mississippi. It's called Mississippi's Freedom Summer Plus 15 by Jerry DeMuth, and it tells about the reunion of people that were part of the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. This article tells about the reunion at a Holiday Inn and the various SNCC workers and so forth, and the organization of the blacks that had been campaigning in Mississippi since the time of the early registration of the white people coming down to help them register. And the article goes on to say, despite all these changes, there is an awareness bitterly that the poor blacks at the movement still suffer from high rates of unemployment. They have malnutrition, disease, inadequate housing and clothing, inferior education, and so forth. And then the article goes on to say, Allard Lowenstein, who helped plan Freedom Summer, but whose establishment ties, including a special ambassadorship position to the United Nations, have since made some suspicious of his involvement, called those hot points a turning point in the country. And it goes on to say that while he was at the meeting, a man named Bob Moses, who was the main force behind the Freedom Summer, who was dedicated to the freedom movement and helping the blacks, was very conspicuously absent. He was invited to attend but declined, that he was the real power behind the movement, just as you would say Lillian Castellana or Ted Charach were the real powers behind opening up the murder of Robert Kennedy, and Lowenstein came in later. This goes on, this article last November suspected Lowenstein and the people there of the places where he was working and his ties, as I say, to the establishment. So the San Francisco Chronicle was calling attention to that this last November. And along those lines was this gentleman, Mr. Dennis Sweeney, the potential assassin who could come along and wipe out Allard Lowenstein if he and Ted Kennedy were to get together and open up the assassinations, or if he was organizing Ted Kennedy's campaign in the following fall. They could pull out of the bag a Mr. Dennis Sweeney who also had the same complaints about Allard Lowenstein being too close to the establishment and betraying the movement. I believe that Dennis Sweeney was under mind control and psychosurgery with electrode implants that he complained of. I think they were valid, but the complaints that he had were already planted. The seeds were already in the newspapers. The people suspected Lowenstein. And if Lowenstein and Ted Kennedy at any point wanted to bring out the information that he had on past investigations, they could use it. And I think he had to be murdered for what he knew, not for what he said while he was alive, but what he knew and could say if the appropriate time came and they wanted to say it. Bob Treber asked me the question on KGO radio, why bother to kill somebody like Allard Lowenstein when Ted Kennedy isn't going to win the election from Jimmy Carter? Why kill his aide or his advance man or the man who works with him, right-hand man, an investigator, and so forth? It would be too obvious to kill Ted Kennedy, and it's true that Ted Kennedy isn't going to win the election, but it also silences him because it's a reminder, one more time, of one more call to the death of somebody. He's had his brothers Robert and John and Mary Jo Kopechny dead in his car, and then one of his aides in campaign advises his right-hand man, advance man in various cities with the primaries killed, and it's one more reminder to Ted Kennedy that these deaths are ever present and all around him, and that I'm sure it's a very tight message. Keep your mouth shut. David Harris remembered Dennis Sweeney. He was a Stanford at Student University. Some newspapers had an article, Allard Lowenstein shot by a carpenter in his work clothes. They didn't say that he went to Stanford University. David Harris went to prison. He didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War. He was against the war. And Dennis Sweeney had a deferment. He was able to get out of the draft because his father had been killed in an earlier war in an airplane crash. And so he decided to take the deferment, and then, according to David Harris, he went out of his mind and went crazy shortly after that. Of course, this assassin walked into the office at Rockefeller Center. He just fired off 7 shots. I think 5 went into Allard Lowenstein. He left, sat in the front desk, put his gun into the basket of the secretary, and waited for the police to come. He was described as incoherent but rambling. He was a loner. Of course, these stories come out of the headlines right away. Who thinks somebody is after him? That's the landlady saying on WNLC New London Radio. Sat in a chair and waited for the police. He didn't tremble. He was calm under questioning. Sweeney was described as having a very fine mind. He had no signs of volatility during his years at Stanford, no great temper tantrums, rather even-tempered. He went to Mississippi, idealistic, to help the blacks to vote. He was active in the anti-war movement. And then for 4 years in the 60s, he was married to a woman named Mary King. In the 60s, up till 1967, things were pretty peaceful in California. Then Mary King's future husband, Peter Bourne, if many of you know that name, came to California from Vietnam. He had been in Georgia. He came from London and Georgia. Vietnam, he was trained in mind control, later to work with Richard Nixon and the White House plumbers, Hunt and Liddy, with their little escapades, and then went on to manage Jimmy Carter's campaign. Mary and Peter Bourne were active in making Jimmy Carter president of the United States. And it's very interesting that Mary's first husband was put into a mental institution from which he never recovered when her husband was so expertise at mind control, and the very person running against Jimmy Carter in this election in 1980 was Mary King's first husband, a perfect candidate for mind control job, and that's just what happened to him. He was committed to a hospital. He was supposed to be sent up to Oregon, that hospital where they made One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But according to the news reports, friends took up a collection and sent him to a mental hospital. Now, nobody has mentioned in the news media what mental hospital he went to. Was it Chestnut Lodge in Maryland, the CIA hospital where they did mind control jobs on various people? I have a book written by Judith Beck Stein from Chicago. She was a graduate of Vassar University and was doing journalism, and she was studying the assassination of John Kennedy and was active in civil rights, and her parents were very prosperous. I believe it was Standard Oil in Chicago, and she wrote a book about how she got drowsy and they shipped her off. She had a drink, and there was evidently something in there to put her to sleep, and the family shipped her off to Chestnut Lodge, and she wrote a book about her hospitalization, and she calls it the Psychiatric Hospital Prison System of America, how she was a victim of this. And in her book she talks about fighting fascism and being concerned about Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy and Hale Boggs and George Wallace and Kent State and Jackson State murders and so forth, and that key people who were interested in these things with good minds and good education could be drugged and put into mental hospitals and locked up to lose all their political activism and literally to become total eunuchs in the American political system. She dropped out of her school training or Vassar or her family beliefs, and they sent her to this hospital to change her head inside out so that she'd stop worrying about these various assassinations and situations. So it seems that this Dennis Sweeney had the same kind of a treatment when he left Mary King. They were married 4 years. Then he was put into a private hospital, and the story is that he left the hospital and went to France and came home. And the best descriptions of this poor man are that he moved around and around a place and never could find himself. And he obviously, according to the people who saw him or knew him the best, was a very blatant example of the government turning an anti-war activist or a pro-civil rights person into a zombie who could do murders, political murders, and wipe out other persons who know too much about the political assassinations. Now, when Dennis Sweeney was arrested, he had a list of 6 other persons he was going to possibly murder, and one of them, according to a newspaper article, could easily have been Senator Ted Kennedy. We haven't seen the list of who he was supposed to murder. That's a secret. But when Lawrence Kwong shot at KGO and he was listening to electrodes inside his head that were directing him to KGO radio station, he had a list of people that he was going to murder. And a man on the air talking to Jim Dunbar the day of the killings, he killed Ben Munson. He went around the office and killed a man in the office because there was a bulletproof glass and he couldn't shoot through the studio. That person was talking about the anti-war movement and against Spiro Agnew. And Lawrence Kwong, who had been to Hong Kong and to been in Hawaii and mental hospitals and had this strange weapon with a concealed number, also had complained the electrodes and the sounds and hearing KGO. He had a list of people that he was supposed to kill, a possibility. And this Dennis Sweeney said there were 6 other individuals for whom he had a strong animosity. Charles Hinkle said that this client believed that Allard Lowenstein was working with the CIA and FBI to hear what his thoughts were through a listening device. Now, the fact that he killed Allard Lowenstein doesn't prove that Lowenstein was with the FBI or the FBI, but the boy had, now a man had a natural grudge because when he was active in the movement, he felt Lowenstein was betraying them and not active with the movement. And later, 15 years later, the same activist had the same feeling about Allard Lowenstein. I've shared those feelings, but I also know that you can still be a part of the FBI like William Sullivan or the CIA, like John Rosselli or Sam Giancana or William Harvey or Sheffield Edwards or George de Mohrenschildt, and you can be killed for what you know. It doesn't prove whether he was with the FBI or CIA, but it gives a good motive because you can control Dennis Sweeney, that Allard Lowenstein is betraying you. When they were active in the movement and he broke away from Lowenstein and felt he was betraying them, it'd be a perfect person to mind control to come back later and have a list of people he could possibly kill, and the original motive would be possibly be valid. This Dennis Sweeney, of course, according to the news, only lived for 6 months in New London, Connecticut, at the place where he was located when Allard Lowenstein was murdered. He was murdered in New York, at Rockefeller Center, but he came down from New London to do the murder. He only lived there 6 months, and of course I always ask, where was he up till 6 months before? He said he was hearing voices and believed that Allard Lowenstein was controlling them, and it's very possible he was hearing voices and was electronically controlled. A Herman Hamilton lived next door to Sweeney, retired Navy man, and he described him as weird, almost a mummy who never had a friend. The question is, after Dr. Jose Delgado did all this work on mind control and electrode implants for Navy intelligence, who is Herman Hamilton? Usually an unemployed carpenter, ne'er-do-well, crazy mummy is hardly living right next door to a retired Navy man. If so, who's paying the rent for this character, and was Hamilton the control? In most of the cases of these mass murders, there's always somebody, and it's usually a government official, who's right there at the end, running the safe house and so forth. According to the stories in the news, Dennis came to blame his political frustrations on Allard Lowenstein. There were political differences and so forth, and that Dennis moved from town to town. It'd be nice to know what towns he went to and where he rented and what stage he was in. As I say, the right questions are never asked. What hospital did he go to if he didn't go to the Oregon hospital? Some accounts say he did go there. There's a question of electric shock and so forth. What treatment he received when he had this breakdown, and the time where his mind totally changed from political activism, caring about the blacks, caring against the Vietnam War, married to Mary King. She divorces him and then goes on to marry a man who works for Nixon's plumbers, Nixon's White House, and then goes on to manage trilateral Jimmy Carter's campaign. At what point did the transition break that Mary King leaves Dennis Sweeney, who becomes a mental vegetable, and takes on Peter Bourne, an expert in mind control and mind experimentations, to go on to work for the White House and the government drug enforcement agencies? Where was the transition that Mary leaves Dennis Sweeney and becomes Peter's wife, and Dennis Sweeney becomes a mental vegetable for 15 years? Where has he been for 15 years? What hospitals? How did he get out of the country? How did he came back? Where was he living? And how did he end up next door to a Navy man? And that transition from Mary King and Mary marrying Peter, coming home from Vietnam, is interesting, because when he was in the Haight-Ashbury area, and the hippies, the anti-war people, were being poisoned and totally put under a mind-control job, losing their minds and being put in mental hospitals, I was told about the activities of government agents in the Haight-Ashbury area. And that's really what broke up the whole hippie movement, was the government bringing in medications and drugs, driving these people crazy, and then putting them in hospitals where they did electric shock, thorazine, prolaxin, and electrode implants. So the people, Peter and Mary Bourne, that managed Jimmy Carter's campaign from Georgia to Washington with on the veneer of the anti-war people, and Carter the liberal, giving them the liberal image, actually had come from the Nixon plumbers White House team. And right now, Mary Bourne, is a full-paid cabinet position for Jimmy Carter at this time, and Peter Bourne works for the United Nations, at least the last I heard of him. As I say, the reports say that Dennis's problem started 15 to 17 years ago during the anti-war movements. He viewed Al as the archetypical traitor of all the political principles he believed in. This is the cover story on why he went after Allard Lowenstein. Dennis believed there was a transmission device implanted either under his scalp or in his mouth. This is very easy, and this is what Lawrence Kwong, as I say, complained about. I have many, many files of articles of surgical implants and the use of them to control people and their behavior and make them violent. And Dennis believed that there were implants. In fact, he had filed down his teeth. He didn't want people reading his thoughts. And I have information about dental work and electronic or radio control through the brain or through the teeth. And he had filed his teeth and thought that people were reading his thoughts through his teeth. Dennis Sweeney met Allard Lowenstein. He was a Stanford at university. As I said before, Lowenstein was the dean of men, teaching a political science course in those days. And Lowenstein said, in quotes, he had been in the forefront of this political activism of the injustices, and he was a very talented person. And then all of a sudden an activist, a civil rights advocate, goes totally bananas during the anti-war movement when people who were fighting these causes were very tight and close together, and the only people who really dropped away were those that were drugged and poisoned. If you don't know the name Peter Bourne, the husband of Mary King Bourne, he's the gentleman working for Jimmy Carter who, with Dow Chemical, coaxed the Mexican government. They gave them $43 million to put paraquat into the marijuana to poison the hippies or the possible anti-war people or protesters in the future. The marijuana coming into Mexico the last couple of years was loaded with a poison that could cause cancer in the next 8 or 10 years, and people who smoked it earlier, just similar to x-rays of feet years ago when children were little and finding incidences of cancer. Now, this deadly chemical paraquat is made by Dow Chemical. It's owned by the Rockefeller Combine, and Peter Bourne, working for Jimmy Carter, was instrumental in heavily paying the Mexican government to spray paraquat that was sold in this country that could poison people in California and Arizona and New Mexico, whoever got it. That's how Peter Bourne feels about those people who drop out from society, who are taking the grass, that they are susceptible to future cancers, and we won't know what the toll of that is for many years to come, the effect of having paraquat just a few years ago. Peter Bourne was kicked out of the White House not too long ago because he was prescribing Quaaludes for somebody in the White House, a woman under an assumed name, and Jimmy Carter had to let him out of his administration, although he employs his wife full-time. But in 1978, July 21st, 1978, there was an article, An Advisor Who Quits Under Fire. This is the New York Times, and it describes from Georgia Dr. Peter Jeffrey Bourne, working for Jimmy Carter, who wrote a prescription under a fictitious name. Dr. Bourne accompanied Mr. Carter to the 1972 Democratic National Convention in Miami Beach, where they failed to persuade Senator George McGovern of South Dakota to choose Mr. Carter as his running mate. They went down there in those days to get, instead of Eagleton and the terrible disasters that McGovern went through in 1972. At that time, Peter Bourne introduced Jimmy Carter to McGovern to try to get him as a running mate, and that didn't work. And they went back to Atlanta, where along with his wife, Mary King, they moved from Atlanta to Washington to become assistant director of the White House Office for Drug Abuse Prevention in Richard Nixon's administration. If they couldn't get Jimmy Carter as vice president under McGovern, then he went on to work for Richard Nixon, and he had a presence in the Republican milieu. And in spite of that, he went on to sell, this is the New York Times, to go out and sell Jimmy Carter. He was co-founder of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and his wife carried liberal credentials as an activist in the Southern Civil Rights Movement in the early 60s, and she worked for the Federal Anti-Poverty Program in the early 70s. And Dr. Bourne and his wife arranged for the Carters to go to Washington parties to meet the so-called left, the civil rights people, the anti-war people, at a time where if Carter couldn't run with McGovern, then Bourne would work for Richard Nixon and the Drug Enforcement Agency. That was G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, and Operation Intercept that he was working with, until Nixon was Watergated out, and then Jimmy Carter went on to become President of the United States. He was, according to the New York Times, a native of Oxford, England. Born there, he came to the United States and studied at Emory University in Atlanta, got his medical degree in 1962, so that's 1 year before Kennedy's assassination, was chief of neuropsychiatric section of the Army Medical Research Team in Vietnam in 1965, was a consultant to the Southeast Asia Health Branch of the Agency for International Development, AID, in 1966 to 67. Then he went to Haight-Ashbury to take care of the hippies, and you know the disaster that brought on, and that's where Dennis Sweeney got his dose of drugs at that time, and Dennis Sweeney was married to Mary King, who later went on to marry Dr. Peter Bourne, graduate from Atlanta, Emory University, advisor to Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter, and then he returned to Georgia to work for the Mental Health Unit in Atlanta, Georgia in 1969, and was named director of the Georgia Office of Drug Abuse by Governor Jimmy Carter in 1971. An interesting career of Peter Bourne and Richard Nixon and the Hunt-Liddy mind control team, the use of Peter Bourne in Southeast Asia with the Army Medical Research Team in mind control, on with the AID, then to Haight-Ashbury, then in Georgia worked with Jimmy Carter to try to get him to be vice president of the Democrats, then back to Washington to work for Nixon and his drug enforcement and his mind teams, then back to Georgia with the drug abuse, and then to run Mary King, Bourne, and Peter Bourne went then to Washington to do the advance work to give that liberal image for Jimmy Carter. But the first husband of Mary King, of all of this, was lost in the civil rights, in the anti-war at the Stanford University, and was zonked out of his head and ended up shooting Allard Lowenstein at a time when he's managing the Democratic campaign against Jimmy Carter in 1980. Very important, if I repeat this over and over, the connections of the man who shot Allard Lowenstein, no matter what he was, whether he was FBI, CIA, or not at all, with the information he had on the past political assassinations at a time when Ted Kennedy could open it up. If he didn't win the election, he was wiped out by a man, the former husband of this Mary King, who was turned into this vegetable. Another mind-controlled zombie with electrodes in his head. In January of 1979, I believe, of this last year, I talked about a suit over brain surgery that had to do with a well-known scientist and inventor, this Leonard Kille, Kille, who had electrode implants put into his head. They wrote a book and a movie called The Terminal Man. It was written by Michael Crichton, a Harvard doctor, and it tells about surgery done by Dr. Vernon Mark, chief of neurosurgery at Boston Hospital, Dr. Frank Irvin, who went on to be professor of psychiatry at UCLA, and how they put electrodes into this head. This woman was married to Leonard Kille, the inventor, and she admitted him to a hospital and told him it was for his own good, and then left him and married another person, and he underwent surgery, and for 12 years he complained about the electrodes in his head, the implants in his head, and he became violent from just hearing these sounds and directions. And when he came out to Veterans Hospital, he was in Oregon also, the same hospital that this Dennis Sweeney was at for a while, and he was at UCLA at Veterans Hospital, and the doctors in Boston and UCLA didn't tell the doctors out in California at Veterans Hospital he actually had electrodes in his head. And he had to put a wastebasket over his head. There was a lawsuit suing the Boston Hospital for the electronics that were put into his brains, the microwaves that were coming after him, and he would talk about those, and he had a wastebasket over his head even when he was in court to keep the radiation off of the court waves. And there was an article in the Los Angeles Examiner saying the scientists watching the court proceedings said that low-level microwaves are generated by the electrodes that were burning in his brain. I never did get a follow-up on this story, and I only found it at one time in the Los Angeles Examiner. But I had followed that case for many, many years because these doctors are very prominent with Dr. Delgado, and they do implant these electrodes, and they put in what they call a stymoceiver. It's a device developed by Dr. Delgado at Yale School, and it lets the brain be recorded and stimulated, and you can be up to 100 feet away without any connecting wires, and you can have remote control like television set, and you can direct people to go and do certain operations. You can talk to them and direct them. And these have been implanted for many, many years. Animals have been stopped. Delgado illustrated nursing apes with babies out their breasts, and they electronically would tell them to break away from their mother, and he could stop bulls in the bull ring in Spain. He demonstrated electronically with no wires attached. And it's these kind of electrodes that are inserted, and they're not just inserted on just ordinary poor people, victims in mental hospitals. They take highly intelligent, trained people, such as this socially minded Stanford student or an inventor, the Polaroid camera and so forth. They take patents away from people, and these electrodes have been implanted in many, many people. And this particular person, this Dennis Sweeney, complained about electrodes and had a list of people to be killed. And there's every reason to believe that he could be electronically controlled. Now, he'll be in jail. He's there now. He's in prison. He can be charged with the murder unless they go to the back of his head or trace the prison records of where he was. It's hard to see these electrodes. It's about the size of a little grain of wheat. It isn't a big thing, and there isn't a big incision, and it's hard to find where the electrode is implanted after it once is implanted. Allard Lowenstein is dead. Dennis Sweeney, a perfectly good mind of an altruistic person, is wiped out. The killings continue every 4 years during elections, and the truth of these stories will never come out unless people of the ilk of Lowenstein talk. What they keep in their heads forever, and what dies with them is too late. People like Ted Kennedy should tell the world what they know and not keep these secrets or play these games for higher stakes of electoral offices or appointments. These tragedies are terrible, and they will continue until some people of good faith have the courage to really speak out and share with the world all the information they have.